Before we get started, I want to direct your attention down to the show notes where you will see a link for a survey. This survey isn't one of those demographic surveys. This is totally different. You know that I travel a lot to see listeners. I've gone to CrimeCon in London. I've seen people all over the United States. I've been to Toronto. And an opportunity was presented to me. Instead of traveling to you, I could travel with you. Trova pairs groups with itineraries in countries around the world. But what I need to know from my audience is, 1, what kind of place would you like to go? And 2, what's your ballpark budget? The survey is not a commitment to go, but it does mean you will be one of the first to hear when the trip does open up. And we can go literally anywhere. Why talk to me in a convention center when we can hang out at Machu Picchu or at a wine tasting in Argentina, or really wherever you can think of hanging out and talking about podcasting, true crime, and just getting to know each other in a small group setting? We could go there. The survey takes practically no time to fill out. It's just a couple of questions to get an idea of what people are interested in. So if you could fill that out, if you would even mildly be interested in going, and hopefully we will be able to put together a trip that people want to go on. One day in April of 2010, Allie Lowitzer talked her mom into letting her walk to work after school. She was 16 and excited about her new job. Cell phone in hand, Allie left the neighborhood, never to be seen again. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Hello and welcome to Crime Lines. I want to first send a huge thank you to Joanne, Allie's mom, for her assistance with this episode. She has done a lot of media over the years, a lot. She is advocating for Allie's case pretty much every moment she has to do so. So when I reached out to her about having Allie's case covered here on Crime Lines, I did offer her 2 options. One was to do an interview with me, but the other was for me to use existing interviews, write my script, and then send it to her so she could look it over to make sure there's no misinformation in it, or if there's anything that I missed that I needed to add back in, she could help me with that. The reason I offer families these options, particularly in cases where there is enough media out there, is because every time they're interviewed, they have to recall all of these traumatic events. I also respect the amount of time it takes for families to advocate for their missing persons. So anything that I can do to make that easier on them, I always offer. So I want to thank her for looking over my script. I did use multiple sources, which as always are linked. But I do want to cite 2 sources at the top, and one is the Disappeared episode on the case, and the other is the Vanished podcast episode on this case. I love the work Marissa does. Every week she is covering another missing persons case with primary sources, original interviews, case files. She reaches out to the police. The work she does on a weekly basis is incredible. So go check out The Vanished if you haven't already. I guarantee she has covered so many cases you've never heard of before that have not gotten media attention. One last thank you goes to Stacy, who is the listener who suggested this case to me. It came up when I was researching the Lisa Pate and Mickey Shunick cases, which I covered back in March. And we'll get into why the cases were connected in the media later on. We have to first back up and start with Alexandria Allie Lowitzer. Allie was born on February 3rd, 1994, to parents John and Joanne. For those who follow missing persons advocacy, you might recognize that February 3rd is also now our National Missing Persons Day, which is not a coincidence. Again, we'll get into that later. Allie grew up in Texas alongside her older brother Mason, and this was a very active family. Allie played softball, she was active in the Girl Scouts, even into high school, and she loved to sing in the choir. But even though she had a very busy life outside of the home, Allie's perfect day was just really hanging out at the house. She had a great group of friends, but she was a homebody, so she would rather have them come over rather than go out. When Allie was about 14, her parents separated, with her dad moving to a new place nearby, and this was hard on Allie, as you can imagine. I think we always need to remember when our kids are 12 to 15 just how many changes they're going through, physically, emotionally, and then even just going from middle school to high school. It's a lot. So when there's another external change in this time period, they definitely need a lot of grace and some time. And it really sounds like that's what John and Joanne gave Allie, and things smoothed out as everyone adjusted to their new normal. In the spring of 2010, Allie was in her second year at Spring High School, and she wasn't entirely sure what she wanted to study in college. She was leaning towards something to do with art. She was very talented all around, singing, music, writing, painting, drawing, all of it. There were so many options open to her, either as a writer or as an artist. The one thing Allie wasn't good at was getting up in the morning, which is so typical of my experience with teenagers. Her mom, Joanne, had to make sure she got up in time to make it to the bus stop, which was just a couple of houses down. But, and I can empathize with this, getting ready wasn't a matter of throwing on a hoodie and running out the door. One of the ways Allie expressed herself was with her style, and she liked the heavy black eyeliner, the Avril Lavigne style. My daughter's style is different from that, but it still takes just as much time for her to get out the door every morning. So as was their routine, on Monday, April 26th, 2010, Joanne started prodding 16-year-old Allie to get out of bed. And as usual, she was successful. Allie was up and out the front door in time to meet the school bus. School was uneventful, and Allie was dismissed from classes at 2:30. As Allie was getting on the bus, she called her mom at work. She had forgotten her house key that morning, and she wanted to make sure the front door was unlocked. Normally, her grandmother would be at the house when she got there, but Grandma wasn't going to be there that day, so she wanted to make sure she could get in. Allie also asked Joanne if she could walk to her job at the burger barn to pick up her paycheck. Allie had been working there for just a few weeks at this point, and it was her first job, so she was eager for that paycheck. The feeling of that first job when you're a teen and the freedom of having your own money, there really isn't anything quite like it. Allie also mentioned she might stay and work a shift if they needed an extra person. The boss at the burger barn was a bit loose with the scheduling, so showing up to work, even when you weren't on the schedule, wasn't weird there at all. Joanne first told Allie no, she couldn't walk to work. She had never walked there before because someone always drove her, and though it was only a quarter mile from her house, it was at a pretty busy intersection. A lot of the route Allie would have walked didn't have sidewalks. Joanne was thinking it might not be the safest idea because of cars and traffic. She certainly wasn't imagining the worst. At some point over the years of this case being reported on, it has slipped into the narrative that Allie's work was just a few doors down from her house, and that just keeps getting repeated, but it is definitely not true. It would not have taken Allie long to walk there, but when you say something is 3 doors down and you're talking about a normal suburban area, you get the impression that you can see the burger barn from her house. If that was the case, Joanne probably wouldn't have hesitated to let her walk. But it was a quarter of a mile, pretty much on the dot, from her house. Now, when Joanne said no, Allie pushed back because she really wanted to go. We know now that Allie was looking for something to do that day after school. It's not clear if she was bored or restless or what, but her plans kept changing. She was first thinking about staying after school to do some work with a teacher, and then maybe she would pick up a shift at the burger barn, and then according to her phone record, she was also texting her friend Jay to see if he wanted to hang out. That's probably why Allie was insisting her mom let her head to work on foot that day. She just wanted something to do, and getting her paycheck was really exciting. Joanne ended up relenting and letting Allie go. Again, this was just a quarter-mile walk, and Allie was 16. She wasn't 6. It's not unreasonable to say yes in this scenario. She did tell Allie to call or text to update her, and if Allie was working, she would just pick her up at the end of the shift. So Allie was on the bus heading home at this point, and Joanne called her older son Mason. He was home at the time, but he was getting ready to leave. So Joanne told him just don't lock the door behind him so that Allie could get in since she forgot her key. Now, with all these after-school details settled, Joanne turned her focus back on work, but noticed that Allie hadn't texted or called to let her know if she was working or not. And when Joanne got home at 5:30, Allie wasn't there. She assumed Allie had picked up the extra shift and forgot to check in. So she texted Allie. She didn't get a reply, but that wasn't concerning in this context. If Allie was working, it was very unlikely she was allowed to have her phone on her. She would probably text back when she had a break. The burger barn closed at 9 p.m., and it took about 20 to 30 minutes past close to have everything cleaned up and prepped for the opening shift. So if Allie was working the full shift after school, she would need to be picked up by about 9:30. However, it was just nagging at Joanne that evening that Allie hadn't contacted her since she had gotten on the school bus. So she decided to just drive over there a little before close just to see what was going on. It was a short drive, so if Allie said she had to stay another 30 minutes, it wasn't a big deal to go home and then come back later. I really hate to interject the as a parent commentary constantly, but this scenario is something that is played out up to this point with my own teens so many times. They forget to check in, and then I check up on them, and they look at me like I have 3 heads for being worried. But like I said, I can only identify with this up to this point because what happens next is exactly what I'm worried about when my kids don't answer their phones. When Joanne got to the restaurant, she was shocked to see that the lights were out and it was closed up. She looked in the windows and could see that even the chairs had been put up on the tables and no one was there. They must have closed early, which really isn't uncommon if it was a slow Monday night. But why hadn't Joanne heard from Allie? She should have called for a ride by then, and if she decided for some reason to just walk home, Joanne would have seen her as she drove the quarter mile. So Joanne was pretty much immediately in a panic. She didn't know where her daughter was, she hadn't heard from her in hours, and the place she should have been at was locked up tight and she wasn't there. Joanne called Allie's father, John, and told him that she didn't know where Allie was. Joanne then called her son Mason and asked if he had seen his sister. He had been home right before she would have gotten there, and he said she just never came into the house. He did hear her bus shortly before he left to go hang out with his friends, but he didn't see her. John tried to stay calm and rational. Maybe Allie got a ride with someone else and would be home soon. Maybe her phone died, and that's why she couldn't let Joanne know where she was. Maybe she went to a friend's house to hang out when work closed early, and she lost track of time. You know, all the usual things you would tell yourself to try to convince yourself that you're overreacting. So they started calling Allie's friends, stopping by some of their houses to see if she was there or if they knew where she was. They were able to do this because they knew Allie's friends. She had a tight-knit circle, and because she usually preferred to have them come over to her house rather than go to their houses, Joanne was pretty familiar with who they were. She also knew Allie had a new boyfriend named DJ who had just been to the house the day before. So Joanne went out to his house, and he told her he had also been calling and texting Allie after school, but never got a response. After driving around to these friends' houses for a bit, Joanne went home hoping she would walk in the door and Allie would be there wondering what all the fuss was about. But she wasn't there, so at 11 p.m., Joanne called the police to report her 16-year-old daughter missing. A deputy came out to the house and talked to Joanne and John, and she took down the basic information, like when and where they last saw Allie. The deputy then asked to take a look at Allie's room, which was in perfect order, and then she told Joanne to call the police in the morning when Allie made it home. Joanne said she asked the deputy the obvious question here, what if Allie doesn't come home? And they were told to call in the morning regardless. But the initial assumption here was that Allie would come home, so it's clear the deputy thought this was a teen girl out late without permission, even though Allie had never done that before. John waited at the house with Joanne for a while before he went back to his place to try to get some sleep, telling himself that Allie was trying out a little rebellion here and they'd deal with it the next day. He imagined Allie would just go straight to school in the morning. Joanne ended up staying up all night waiting on Allie, and like John, she was trying to convince herself that Allie was just being a little rebellious. But in the morning, Allie hadn't returned, and she didn't show up at school. Her parents called the police again and found that their concerns were still just not being heard. Allie was, to the police, a runaway who would show back up soon. Not content to wait on this, the family took to social media and posted that Allie was missing. They wanted her friends and schoolmates to see it in case they knew something. And they did get some tips over the first few days saying that Allie had never actually gotten on the bus. At least one tip was that she was seen crossing the street from the high school going to a Burger King. Now, if this was true, it changed the family's understanding of what happened that afternoon, meaning she went missing from school, which was 6.5 miles away from where they thought she had last been. Because Mason hadn't seen her after school, maybe it was possible. There was a very easy way to vet this tip since the public school buses had cameras. And since the police weren't investigating, John had to take it on himself to go down to the school and to the bus company. The school had cameras that showed Allie leaving, and the bus had cameras showing her on the bus as well as getting off the bus at her usual stop, about 30 feet from her front door. John saw that 2 boys got off at the same stop at the same time, and he recognized one of them as a neighbor. So he asked him if he had seen Allie the day she went missing, and he said that she was behind them playing on her phone. She was probably texting someone like she normally did. Allie had just gotten that cell phone for Christmas, and she racked up thousands and thousands of texts from December to April. The boy said that instead of going to her house, though, Allie straggled behind and then headed out of the neighborhood in the direction of the burger barn. This was another lead John, of course, followed up on. He checked with the owner of the burger barn, and he said Allie had not worked that day, and it didn't look like she had ever come in because her paycheck was still there. None of the employees who had worked that shift saw her, but by the time John had talked to them, the security footage that could have confirmed this was gone. The company had a system that would overwrite itself every 24 hours. You may be wondering about Allie's cell phone at this point, and that's another clue we have thanks to the family. Allie having a cell phone was pretty new, so they didn't think to check if they could get information the first night Allie went missing. It was the next day that Joanne remembered that their cell phone carrier had a program that would show where everyone on the plan was. It's like a Find My iPhone or a Life 360 app. Joanne got online and was able to see that Allie's phone last pinged off a tower right outside their neighborhood around the time she got off the bus. And in spite of Allie texting thousands of times per month and people repeatedly calling her the day she went missing and into the next day, the phone never pinged on another tower. Over the next few days, the family was conducting their own searches and making phone calls and following up on tips that they got through social media. And then it occurred to John that there was a gas station across the street from the burger barn, and they might have security cameras that faced the street. They did, and unlike the burger barn cameras, they had not been recorded over. John told Marissa with the Vanish podcast that the gas station had been incredibly helpful during the early searches for Allie, and they just went and gave him a disc of the camera footage from 1 p.m. until 6 p.m. on the day she went missing. The clarity on this footage was not the greatest, but it was good enough to see that Allie never walked into frame. He tried to look in the windows of the passing cars to see if she was in one of them, but it was not high quality enough for that. John handed the disc over to the police, thinking that they could check the makes and models of the cars, maybe get a license plate or two. Maybe they could find a suspect or even a witness. As far as the family understands, the disc that was handed to the police has been lost, without the footage ever being analyzed or enhanced. So after about a week of the family's own investigation, they knew that Allie had gotten home from school. She walked away from the neighborhood with the intention of walking a quarter mile, and then she vanished with her cell phone very quickly going dead. And all of that was thanks to the family, because if they waited on the police investigation, they would have none of this. The family did get help with their searches thanks to Allie's connection to the Girl Scouts. Someone from the local council told Joanne about an organization called the Laura Recovery Center, which helped families with missing loved ones. This nonprofit was started by Bob and Gay Smither in 1998, and they named it after their daughter, who had been a Girl Scout. Laura Kate Smither, like Allie, had grown up in the Houston metro area, only she grew up on the other side of the city. In April of 1997, Laura was 12 years old, and as a dancer, she took her fitness pretty seriously. So on the morning of April 3rd, she asked her mother if she could go out on a run while she was waiting on breakfast to be cooked. Her mom said yes, but Laura never came home. She was missing for 17 days when her body was found 12 miles from her house. She had been murdered. 4 months later, a 17-year-old named Jessica Kane went missing in the Houston area, and the Smither family heard about it. They knew what Jessica's family was going through because they had just gone through it themselves. They had to do media, searches, meetings with detectives, the things the average person has never had to think about. So they offered their support and experience to Jessica Kane's family, even in their own grief. It would turn out, though they didn't know it at the time, that it was the same man who killed both Laura and Jessica. The year after both girls disappeared, William Reese was convicted of kidnapping a 19-year-old in the Houston area. She escaped by jumping out of a moving truck. She was severely injured, but survived. She was able to recall his license plate number, which then led the police right to him. He ended up with a 60-year sentence. Fast forward to 2015, and his DNA was a match to the murder of a 19-year-old named Tiffany Johnston from Oklahoma. After being charged with her murder, William Reese decided to confess to other crimes, and that included Laura and Jessica's murders. He claimed Laura was his first murder, initially saying he accidentally hit her with his car, but then later he admitted he strangled her. He then led the police to where he left Jessica Kane's body. So all that to say that the Smither family knew that there was a steep learning curve when families have to navigate a missing loved one. It was a lesson they learned the hard way, but they could then take that and help other families with what they knew, like they helped Jessica Kane's family. And so they began the Laura Recovery Center. The LRC at the time provided resources and organized searches. So while the police were treating Allie as a runaway, the LRC came in to organize the volunteer-led searches, getting hundreds of volunteers on board to go out on foot, ATV, horseback, with dogs, and whatever else they could get the resources for. By May 3rd, after Allie had been missing for a week, the family had turned over everything they found to the police, which included the footage from the bus station and the gas station. That got the deputies to at least come back out to the house, and they did a more detailed search of Allie's room, hoping maybe they could figure out where she might be. They ended up finding a notebook amongst her things, and on one page, in the middle of some school notes and doodles, there was a paragraph about running away. What they didn't find was any other reference to running away, including in her current journal where she wrote about literally everything else. There was no indication in this little blurb about running away that it was written anytime recently, and there was no evidence that it was an ongoing thought. But in my opinion, confirmation bias took over as soon as they saw this. They walked into that bedroom thinking Allie ran away, and they grabbed the one piece of evidence they had to support it, and they gave it undue weight. There were other indications that she wasn't a runaway that seemed to have been ignored. First, we have her history. Allie had never run away before. She was the kind of kid who called her mom to tell her where she would be. That very day, she called to ask permission to walk a quarter mile from her house. She was active in school activities that she didn't show up for, and she had plans with friends that she didn't keep. Then we have Allie's room. She left her cell phone charger behind, all of her clothes, and even money, not to mention she had left that paycheck. Why would she run away with nothing but the clothes on her back and her cell phone? A cell phone she couldn't charge because she left without the charger. And that would have been so easy for her to grab. We know she knew nobody would be home after school because she called to make sure the door would be unlocked. So how easy would it have been for her to go inside when no one was home and pack a bag, grab her charger, grab some money, and go? But she didn't, which indicates to me that she didn't intend to be gone long enough that her phone would need to be charged. And her phone seems to be yet another indication she didn't run away. Based on her phone records, Allie sent between 100 and 150 texts per day. But she completely stopped using her phone at 2:57 p.m. when she was likely on her walk to the burger barn. She left conversations unfinished, conversations she was busy having right up until that point. Running away just didn't make sense in this scenario, but that was the theory, though the police did upgrade her to endangered runaway. Now, that designation doesn't really change the course of the investigation, but it is given whenever a teen takes off without any preparation or catalyst, because then there's a concern about mental health issues that may put them at risk. The family still didn't believe this was a runaway situation and continued their own investigation and searches until late May when the case was transferred to the Harris County Sheriff. Immediately, there was a shift in the focus. Once they caught up on the details of the case, they started investigating this as though Allie didn't leave voluntarily. And that started with looking at the family. And that makes sense from an investigative standpoint, but for the family, it was like a 1-2 punch. They waited a month for an investigation to even begin, but then instead of getting out there and looking for Allie, they started interrogating John and Mason and polygraphing all 3 family members while checking up on their alibis. It's not that the family didn't understand that they needed to be cleared first, but wouldn't it have been nice if that was done in the first month Allie was missing, so that when the Harris County Sheriff came in and started taking the case seriously, they would be further along in the investigation and could start looking outward. John was officially cleared through his interview, polygraph, and alibi. Mason was not exactly cleared, but he's not a suspect either. The issue seems to be his alibi. He was home, said Allie never showed up, and then he left to meet with his friends. His friends confirmed his alibi, but friends giving alibis is about as solid as your mother giving one. They're seen as being willing to back up a friend. But like I said, Mason is not being looked at as a suspect. When the family had been investigated and largely ruled out, they were able to look into some other people, names mostly given to them by the family. Allie was texting that friend Jay to see if he wanted to hang out that day, so he seemed to be an obvious person to talk to. He said he had plans and didn't get together with Allie that afternoon, and it seems like that has been verified. Allie also had some issues with other girls at school, some that was just teen drama, but some rose to the level of bullying. Not that Allie was being the bully, but rather she was being bullied and threatened by a group of girls. And then there was a guy at work who had asked her out and was rejected, mostly because he was too old for her. But no matter how many leads they followed up on, none got the investigators any closer to knowing where Allie was. The early leads were exhausted, and then the case became one of those cases that they picked up when something was called in. For instance, a few years after Allie went missing, some of her friends told her parents that Allie may have been in contact with an older man. They hadn't said anything back in 2010 because they didn't want Allie to be in extra trouble when she came home. But then she didn't come home, so they came forward with this information. The issue with this information, though, is that no one knew the guy's name, and her parents couldn't find a trace of him in her life. And they had quite a bit of access into where those secrets might be. They had her journals. He wasn't mentioned in there. They had her phone records, and no mysterious phone number to some older man showed up. This was 2010, so it was before apps that deleted messages like Snapchat, and Allie did not have a home computer. Theirs had a virus, so it was not up and running at the time. And she didn't have a data plan on her phone, so anytime she accessed the internet through her phone, it would show up on the bill, and they had no evidence she had been accessing any type of websites or communication outside of texting. So if Allie was communicating with some older guy somehow, they couldn't find any proof of it. Another lead that came in the years after Allie's disappearance was in 2010, when Brandon Laverne pleaded guilty to 2 murders in the Lafayette, Louisiana area. And if you remember from my coverage of those cases, Brandon was caught in part because his white truck was seen on surveillance cameras in the vicinity of where one of his victims, Mickey Shunick, was last seen riding her bike. The Lowitzer family had a private investigator at the time who saw the reports on this and thought about following up on it. And there are a few things that make pursuing this lead make sense. For one thing, Brandon's sister lived in the area, and he did make trips to visit her in 2010. Also, the tip line in Allie's case had gotten 2 tips that someone looking like Allie was seen talking to a man in a white extended cab pickup truck. It sounded a lot like the truck Brandon Laverne was driving 2 years later when he abducted and murdered Mickey Shunick. There are also reports that the partial plate numbers observed by a witness matched Brandon's truck. This lead was followed until they hit a dead end. For one thing, Brandon was not driving a white truck at the time. But most importantly, he had an airtight alibi. He was at work that day, and his work was an offshore oil rig. Short of hopping on a boat, Brandon could not have been in Spring, Texas when Allie went missing. But there was another promising tip that came in from Ohio not long after this. A woman out there said she saw a young woman who looked just like Allie at a church event that was serving the unhoused population. The girl was there to get some help, and she seemed very hesitant to talk to anyone. The family's PI actually went out to the Columbus area and hit the streets undercover and armed with Allie's photo. People looked at it and said that it looked like a girl who went by Alley Cat. It seemed like what were the odds that it was someone else who looked like Allie and used that name? Based on the circumstances, it was suspected that this teenager, whether she was Allie or not, was being trafficked. Working with the local police, there was a raid on the house that Alley Cat was staying in, and several arrests were made. 8 women who had been trafficked were rescued, but the girl who looked like Allie was not there. Though the disappeared episode on the case leans pretty heavily on the sighting in their coverage of the case, the young woman who looked like Allie was arrested months later and turned out not to be her. This was a devastating moment because this seemed like such a promising lead, and it had been crushing to find out that it was just yet another dead end. The family holds out hope that Allie is still alive, largely because there's no evidence otherwise. And due to this hope that she is still alive and could be able to reach out one day, Allie's mom kept her cell phone connected for 12 years. It cost her nearly $9,000 over that time. But the only people who ever called were spammers and scammers, so in early 2023, she went ahead and canceled it. Part of why she held on to it for so long was because it was a connection to Allie. Allie had just gotten it as a Christmas present months before, and we all know how excited teens are with their first cell phone. But we know that today, Allie could call anyone in the world, tell them who she is, and someone will figure out how to get in touch with the family. They are not hard to find, and they maintain both a website and a Facebook page, keeping Allie's name out there. And the efforts have benefited so many other families of missing persons. Through Joanne's advocacy, she was able to get Houston, then Texas, and finally the United States to have a Missing Persons Day. Due to her efforts, the National Missing Persons Day is February 3rd. Allie's birthday. At the time Allie went missing, she was wearing a gray hoodie, a white t-shirt, white and black checkered skinny jeans, and black tennis shoes. She has braces on her teeth, and as far as belongings go, she had a blue LG slide phone and a multicolored checkered backpack, neither of which have been found. I will leave photos of Allie, including a recent age progression, on the website, basementfortproductions.com. It will be linked in the show notes. Just click where it says Case Timeline, and it will bring you right there. If you have any information about Allie or her disappearance, please contact NCMEC at 1-800-THE-LOST or the Harris County Sheriff's Office at 1-713-221-6000. So let's do it. Let's bring Allie home. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support.